I'd like to do today is take the opportunity to present a little bit of previous work that we've been working on that set up the current project, and then work across a couple of different domains, looking at the relationship more generally between social policy and mental health, and with a focus in this work on the disability support pension. I think more broadly my interests are in the social determinants and the social consequences of mental health, common mental disorders, in particular anxiety and depression, and working with a range of Commonwealth and hopefully in the future state government agencies working in the area. So I'm relatively new to Melbourne, been at the University of Melbourne for just under 2 years now, having come from the ANU. So firstly, the standard sorts of acknowledgements. Tim and Kim, I sort of have a very tight selection criteria in my choice of postdocs. So I'm looking for possibly a Tom or a Pim as sort of the replacement when Tim moves on. Using the Hilda survey data in a lot of this work. So again, the standard disclaimer around this all being my responsibility, and then acknowledgement of the funding coming from my fellowship, despite the peripheral connection between the topic and this work, and a couple of ARC discovery projects. So what I'd like to do during the presentation today is run through a few topics. Firstly, talk about why mental health is relevant for social policy more generally, mental health and the disability support pension. I'm sure that this background will be familiar to most people in the audience, and I won't dwell on that for very long at all. Talk about what my perceptions are of what's driving some of the reform that's underway around disability support pension in Australia, reflecting on the welfare reform process, community attitudes and media coverage, and then use Hilda data to analyse and provide some evidence that I hope contributes to understanding these issues in terms of the profile of disability support pension recipients prior to the transition onto payment, and then looking at trajectories of mental health leading up to and post the transition onto the DSP, and then some discussion of limitations, future directions, and so on. So, first topic, why is mental health relevant? I think it's important to differentiate what I'm talking about when I'm talking about mental health. So differentiate mental health from broader well-being or the sorts of general despair and sadness that we all experience in our life. We're really talking about mental health at a clinical level in much of the work that I focus on. So that includes the low prevalence disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, that aren't very common in the population but have a profound effect. But then, as I said, much of the focus of my work is on the common mental disorders, so anxiety, depression, substance use disorders. They're experienced by about 1 in 5 Australians each year. And in addition, those who experience these symptoms at a subsyndromal level, so not quite at the level that warrants a diagnostic classification, can still experience significant disability and burden. And mental health is important because when you compare the profile of mental illness to the general, to other chronic diseases and conditions. So here are some graphs from an early AIHW report that sort of show, if you look at other chronic disorders, diseases like cancer, cardiovascular disease and musculoskeletal disorders, the peak of the disability, the onset, the prevalence of these disorders occurs post-working age years. Whereas in contrast, the onset of mental disorders generally occurs in adolescence or early adulthood and continues throughout the adult lifespan. So that means that mental disorders are going to be experienced across the life course rather than their incidence prevalence being restricted to the post-working age years. In addition, because of that onset of depression, anxiety, other mental disorders during adolescence, early adulthood, they have significant social effects. So they impact on educational attainment. They can impact on the transition into the workforce, the ability of one to establish and develop a career, family and relationship formation and maintenance. And it can also play out through greater likelihood of unemployment and then more difficulty becoming re-employed and workforce participation overall. So not only do we have the actual occurrence of these disorders during the peak working age years, but the effect of those can have adverse social consequences that continue to ripple and cascade through the life course as well. And this is reflected when you look at the level of disability associated with mental disorders. So this is a graphic from the Global Burden of Disease Project. Again, I'm not saying anything that the audience in the room probably don't already recognise, but mental disorders are the primary cause in Australia, as well as other high-income countries, as well as increasingly in low and middle-income countries, of disability years of life lived with disability. And these are the figures for Australia for the key working age population, 15 to 49 years. And it's a neat infographic at the health metrics site that you can play with all of this data from all of the different countries as well. So that's the broader justification for my interest in mental health and social policy more generally. What about the disability support pension in particular? So again, nothing that I suspect you aren't familiar with. This is a graph from one of the more recent DSS reports on the characteristics of disability support pension recipients. And what it shows is that since the early 2000s, there's been a change in the profile of the disability pension population. So whereas musculoskeletal disorders dominated disability support pension in terms of the primary medical condition, over time, the proportion of the population with musculoskeletal disorders has declined as the proportion with mental disorders increased, to the point where in the early 2010s, mental disorders became the primary or the largest primary medical condition amongst disability support pension recipients. And that's the case for both men and women. This is the latest data that's published, but the trend holds out in data that you request from the department itself. And the reason that change has occurred, obviously, is because of the flow in, and that difference is more marked when you look at recent flows into the disability support pension population, with around a third of those in 2012-13 receiving the pension on the basis of a psychological mental health condition. So there's a lot of consideration about why and how this change has occurred. We did some work with the two national surveys of mental health and wellbeing. So these were surveys conducted by the ABS on behalf of the Department of Health in 1997 and then 2007. And basically the approach was not to just use symptom scales or to ask people about their previous diagnosis, but they conducted structured diagnostic interviews, so conducted by lay but highly trained interviewers. And basically what these interviews did was provide a proxy for a clinical diagnosis, measuring the symptoms and the criteria to meet a DSM or an ICD-10 classification of a range of depressive, anxiety and substance use disorders, to then provide estimates in the population that are independent of whether or not people have seen a medical professional, whether they have a diagnosis or whether they've sought treatment. And basically those surveys are where the data comes from that shows that around about 20% of the Australian population has a mental disorder in any 12 months. And what we were particularly interested in a couple of papers was looking at the relationship, or the mental health status of welfare recipients, so people receiving income support, but across the whole range of payments. And the 2007 survey suggested that around about a third, a little over a third of income support recipients were identified with a diagnosable mental disorder, as opposed to 20% or just under 20% in the general population. But importantly, I think, and something that I don't think was as recognised amongst policymakers, was that the morbidity was just as common, if not more common, amongst some of the other payment categories as what it was amongst the disability support pension category. So you can see on this graph that parenting payment recipients with a partnered or sole parents had higher rates of depression and anxiety than what was observed in what we developed as a proxy for the disability support pension. When we compared the results from the two surveys, so 97 and 2007, that was a decade where there was a lot of change happening in Australia in terms of mental health policy, but also in terms of welfare policy at the time. So much more of a focus on activation, mutual obligations, tightening up the eligibility criteria around parenting payments, and also the ramping up of the eligibility age for women receiving the age pension. So there was a lot of change going on. What we found was that there wasn't very much change in terms of, or there wasn't any change at all at the population level in terms of the prevalence of mental disorders. There was very little difference in terms of the prevalence of mental disorders amongst the welfare population over time. But what we did find was that whereas in 97 we estimated that just under a third of the welfare receiving population with a mental disorder were on the disability pension, in 2007 that had increased to around 45%. Now, these are estimates based on the data, but it does coincide with the change in the profile of the disability pension that we saw in those earlier figures. So we argue that maybe the sorts of policy changes that were occurring, pushing the population on parenting payment and unemployment payments closer, trying to push them closer to workforce participation, was actually having a perverse and unintended effect for those with mental disorders, of making them take the safer option and sort of move towards the disability pension. Also motivated by the fact that the differential between the allowance and the pensions had increased over that time as well, and actually resulted in this group of disadvantaged welfare recipients moving further away from the labour force. A hypothesis that we will investigate further. So basically the point of the exercise thus far has been to say that the prevalence of mental disorders on DSP is consistent with expectations based on what we know about the disability, the burden associated with mental disorders, as evident from the GDB, GBD, and the other analysis that we've undertaken using the national survey. But that doesn't mean that this isn't a public or a policy concern. So, aim 3, perceptions of what's driving reform in the disability pension area. I think there are two main themes, two main reports that I'd like to focus on. The first is the report from the Welfare Task Force that came out a couple of years ago, and the second is the Productivity Commission report on disability care and support. So the Welfare Reform Task Force made a lot of recommendations and interpretation around the match of community expectations with what the welfare system is delivering. So they spoke about the requirements for people to participate in employment haven't kept pace with changing social values and expectations, that to be socially sustainable, the welfare system needs to be aligned and have broad community acceptance and support and reflect community values and expectations. There's a need for it to be seen as fair, to be fair and to be seen as being fair. They also talk in places about the benefits of work, specifically for those individuals with mental disorders. So the view of work as therapy. So there was lots of discussion about community perceptions and attitudes, but not a lot of evidence to support that in the report itself. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence about what community views are. The Productivity Commission report, on the other hand, focused more on the match of mental disorders with the broader disability support pension parameters. So noting that mental health is episodic in nature, and so the current disability pension doesn't provide a form of support that encourages participation during those times when people with mental illness are able to work. And the recommendations for a supported living pension spoke about a pension that had an assessed work capacity of less than 8 hours a week, so tightening up that work capacity for the pension compared to where it currently stands. And also the assessment that incapacity is likely to last for 5 years, which is an extension of time as well. So these things will play out very specifically amongst the population with a mental disorder. So there isn't the level of data in Australia around community attitudes that there is elsewhere. So we can call on the Social Attitude Survey in the UK, which has collected data on attitudes towards welfare and welfare recipients over a long period of time. And I think looking at this data, I think it's Ben Bornberg who argued that there was a time of crisis in the welfare social security system in Britain, with increasing levels of suspicion in the population towards the welfare system. Here, what's represented is the proportion of people who agree that large numbers of people are falsely claiming benefits. And you can see that over time, there's been a steady increase in the reports from the population about fraud in the welfare system, at the same time that actual fraud levels are declining.
Are you saying that the far right, 85% of the population?
Yes, that they agree strongly or agree that large numbers are falsely claiming benefits. Yep. And so if you undermine that consensus in the community for the welfare system, then where do you go to from there? But we don't have similar data in Australia. So one way of trying to tap into community attitudes may be to look at the media coverage around welfare. So here's just a random selection that I've chosen from a quick search through a media database. So the Daily Telegraph, time's up for welfare cheats, lazy bludgers rejecting jobs, hunt on for welfare cheats on Facebook, cynical bludge makes us sick, exploiting a medical loophole, these dull bludgers are. How to fudge a bludge, this is one of my favourites. So the army of bludgers are using an online step-by-step guide to con doctors into giving them DSP. A bludger detector, dumping the DSP routers, older routers now in the sites, and routers losing their DSP. So maybe media coverage provides some indicator of community attitudes. Maybe it's a driver of community attitudes. So rather than just present the qualitative research, we have recently done a little bit of content analysis, drawing on newspaper articles over the past 15 years. So we focused on some of the larger metropolitan newspapers, and this is really early work at this stage. So we pulled stories from the Daily Telegraph, the Herald Sun, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Age, and the Australian. We identified those news stories that specifically referred to the disability support pension. So we used a range of terms that we identified had been used to talk about this payment. We've done a similar analysis with unemployment payments as well. And then using a dictionary of terms surrounding the concept of fraud, then identified the proportion of those articles that made mention to fraud, and looked at that by year. We've cut this a number of different ways. I'll just report the crude analysis here. We've done analysis excluding those articles that are really focused on welfare reform processes or are specifically tied to the budget process. We've also undertaken some analysis where we've looked for the proximity of the words related to fraud and the terms around disability pension as well, and we get consistent results with all of that analysis. And basically what we find is that there has been a trend, sort of a hint of a curvilinear relationship, but certainly in the last 5-6 years, there's been an uptick in the proportion of articles in newspapers that make mention to fraud in the context of discussing disability support pension as well. So we haven't got equivalent data to what's in the UK, but this is taking us some way there. The other thing that we've done is run our own relatively small study when you compare it to the sort of large population surveys, measuring attitudes directly. So this is part of a broader program of work looking at welfare stigma more generally. So we had data from just over 400 Australian adults from an online Qualtrics survey, had quotas by age and gender, mean age of about 46. And the approach that we used was to present brief descriptions of the different income support payments. So we spoke about the nature of the payment. So age pension is a government payment for people aged 65 and older whose income and assets are below a certain limit. We spoke about what the purpose of the payment is, as enunciated by Centrelink or Human Services. So it's designed to ensure senior Australians have adequate means of support. We spoke about the level of payment, so maximum payment rate for someone who's single is blah, blah, blah. And then we spoke about the breadth or the coverage of that payment. So around 2.3 million Australians receive the age pension. And we did that for a set of different payments. So the same thing with DSP, reduced capacity, income, assets limits, the amount of payment. There are around 820,000 people receiving DSP, and most people are receiving it because of mental health, musculoskeletal or intellectual or learning disabilities. After each of these brief descriptions, we then had 26 comments about each of the payments and asked the participants to rate their level of agreement or disagreement on a 5-point scale. And we randomised the order in which the payment types were presented and the questions as well. Now, as I said, this was part of a broader project looking at welfare stigma, so we're looking at a whole range of dimensions and looking at the latent factors that underlie welfare stigma. But the key item that I'm looking at here is the notion that people are falsely claiming payment. So replicating the item that was in the British survey. Now, according to Van Alshot and others, perceptions of deservingness, positive attitudes, are based on 5 criteria. So we're more likely to view welfare recipients as deserving of payment if they're not in control, so they're not responsible for the circumstances they find themselves in, they have high levels of need. We consider them to be similar to us rather than the other, that they demonstrate the appropriate attitude, they're compliant and grateful, and the demonstration or the potential for reciprocity. So they've previously contributed or they will contribute in the future. So on the basis of this, we thought that perceptions of fraud, deservingness would be high, perceptions of fraud low for age pension recipients. They've contributed, the stereotypic perception is they've contributed throughout their life, they're in a high need, and they have no control. You can't stop ageing. So we predict that they will have low levels of perceived fraud. In contrast, the stereotype of New Start allowance, lazy, taking advantage of the system, no levels of reciprocity, so low deservingness, high perception that they'll have high levels of fraud. But where does the disability support pension lie? You would think that a demonstrated disability would mean that there is low levels of control, but is that how it plays out? So we have our scale here from none falsely claiming. So the question is, I agree that the percent who agree that many people are falsely claiming this payment. So very low levels up to higher levels. So as you can imagine from what I suggested, age pension sits down the left-hand side of the scale. So people don't think that very few people agree that many age pensioners are falsely claiming the payment. At the other end of the distribution is the New Starter unemployment allowance. About 43% of people agreed that yes, a large proportion of people receiving New Start allowance are falsely claiming this payment. So the question for you is, where does the disability pension sit? Does it sit down this end? So they're seen as deserving of payment and so therefore are viewed similar to the age pension, or are they seen as undeserving and sit somewhere near the New Start payment? Well, this was conducted 6 or 9 months ago, so the media coverage is out there. Yes.
Would you perhaps expect that the DSP might actually vary along that line according to the components of it? For example, you might put one end and this might be the other.
It could be. It could be. But we conducted a very crude analysis just looking at the payment type itself, just more broadly. Perhaps not surprisingly then, given the conversation and the setup, it sits there right next to DSP. So when asked about their perceptions of the disability support pension, it's indistinguishable from the New Start allowance. Yep.
You set up a whole bunch of deservingness and really back and forward.
Mm-hmm.
But it also links to the ability to make fraudulent claims. Like, how easy is it to be fraudulent about your age for an age
Yeah,
to
yeah.
do presumably. So I wonder when they're responding to your survey, they also take, because all you ask is how many people are falsely claiming. It could be because of this disturbing hypothesis that you've outlined, or it could just be because it might be easier
Yep.
to be fraudulent when it comes to a mental health problem or to the staff.
Yep. I suppose the comparison then would be something like carer allowance as well, which could be fraudulently claimed, but sort of sits right up this end as well, near the age pension as well. So that there are a range of other payments that we've looked at that sort of falling on this distribution. So I've sort of taken the most common examples here, but yes, and I think in terms of where this work goes and further elaboration, when we tease out all of those other items, I think we'll have a better perception of what's going on. So I suppose the point of the exercise so far is to say, okay, so where we do look in the Australian context, we've got media coverage demonstrating negative attitudes, and then we've got this albeit less than representative survey that we've conducted that's showing a similar sort of result. Yes, that they could skip questions and move on. This is of the total. So that there were very few. There were very few people who used the not wanting to respond option in these items at all.
Not wanting to respond, but responding, I don't know.
I think because the perception is the question is about their perceptions. So it wasn't about what they know; it was about their perceptions. So I don't know how many people would say I don't know, because they're asked whether you agree. It's an interesting question. Yes. Yep.
Am I correct in remembering that there was a parliamentary inquiry, or the government did look into fraudulent claims that there was an increase, is that right? Or that is there some truth to what the media picked up on and they
there are some claims that are overturned, and there was a review process. When was that? A couple of budgets ago, that was working through and reassessing disability pension recipients.
And I thought that it was actually the government saying that
I'm not sure about that.
Yep. Recall a government study or a recall of a particular individual in the government.
Yep.
the paper I was looking at, I'll have to go back and find it. It wasn't a particular person saying it. It was actually a report.
Okay.
I'm
Yep.
being slighted in a minute.
Okay. Yep.
I was just wondering what the circumstances were of the people that you were surveying. Were they themselves in these questions, or?
They could have been. Income.
Are they of Australia in general in terms of people on pensions and people who are?
Yeah. Look. The very taking account of income support receipt of the respondents didn't alter the profile of results. They appeared in that sample with the sort of prevalence that you would expect given the prevalence within the age range. But yes, an online panel obviously has its limitations.
Yeah.
So.
I was wondering about regional differences. Did you do quotas for regions, or
We didn't know. No.
regional differences, or not?
And I think with the numbers, we wouldn't be able to tease down at that level. Okay. So onto some Hilda analysis then. So we've made an effort to pull out some data that reflects on what the potential community attitudes are. So let's have a look at some of this evidence. Yep.
Do you have any, I mean, I think there's a lot of fraud something different, and I think that shouldn't be there. There shouldn't be a future. So what's the social support for this policies? Do you have any know how this is related?
We've collected data on support for the income support system, as well as stigmatizing negative attitudes towards recipients themselves, and they are somewhat distinct dimensions. So people do have more favourable views towards the system itself, as opposed to those who are using the system. The attitudes amongst those using the system towards those who use the system are generally stronger and more negative, somewhat paradoxically. But again, that's one of those topics that we'll try and tease out more when we look at what that latent structure of attitudes towards welfare recipients and the welfare system is. So a number of those items that I popped up very briefly are more systemic attitudes towards the system, as opposed to attitudes towards the individual using the system. So there is a solid body of evidence, international evidence, looking at the association between mental health, mental disorders, and subsequent disability pension receipt. Most of it drawn from Scandinavian countries. And the most common approach is a prospective design based on linked survey data, which measures health at a particular point in time, and then administrative data from the welfare or income support system on the transition to a disability pension. And the data shows the strong relationship that you would expect. There are a few advantages and a few disadvantages of this type of methodology. Obviously, when you link to administrative data, you have objective data on disability pension receipt, and you also have data on the primary medical condition. So you know more and have more confidence in the outcome than what you have if you rely on self-report of disability pension or type of income support receipt. These sorts of studies have independent health measures. So the measures of mental health are separate from the actual application process. But health is often only assessed at a single point in time, and then you're looking at transitions to disability over, in some cases, quite a long period of time, up to a decade or so. Would you expect the association between mental health at a point in time and disability pension transition a decade hence to be evident? So we've conducted a couple of separate analyses using the Hilda survey data. We've used release 15, which gives us 15 annual waves. So again, I think it's probably safe to assume that everyone here is somewhat familiar with the Hilda survey. Large household panel survey, between 13 and 17,000 respondents each wave. Lots of data on income, questions about receipt of income support and then type of income support currently being received, measures of disability and mental health measured through the SF36. We restrict this analysis to working age respondents. As I just mentioned, we've got self-report income support status. We restrict the analysis to those people who were initially not receiving the DSP and then follow them through to either their receipt of a disability pension or to and beyond. So the first set of analyses just sought to see whether or not we could find a pattern of results with the Hilda survey that would expect based on what we know from the administrative data and the international evidence as well. So here we draw on the health module in the Hilda survey that was included in waves 9 and 13. We look at individuals' respondents' circumstances at that point in time, and then whether or not they transition to a disability pension the following wave. And we're looking at 3 particular measures. So individuals who report that they have a diagnosis of depression or anxiety or some other mental illness at some point in time, reported medication use for mental illness, and then whether or not they've consulted with a mental health professional at some point in the last 12 months. And so we're estimating using population weights, the transitions to DSP. I took out the models, so we've got around over 14,000 respondents, over 21,000 observations, and we observe 179 transitions onto the disability support pension. So what do we find? So those people who subsequently do not move on to DSP, about 10% of those said that they had a prior diagnosis of mental health. Whereas amongst those who did transition to DSP, around about a third said that they had a prior diagnosis. So this is prior to them reporting receipt of DSP. Similarly, amongst those who don't transition to the DSP, around 6% said they'd consulted a mental health professional in the past 12 months, as opposed to 22% of those who do transition to DSP. And similarly, amongst those who do not transition to DSP, around 6% said that they'd taken a prescription medication for mental illness, as opposed to 31% of those who do transition. And if you sum all of those together, amongst those who don't transition to DSP in the subsequent year, around 10% had any of the above characteristics, compared to around 43% of those who do transition onto the DSP.
Do you know when they first transition to DSP? Because they often they move around a lot.
Yep. So we know that at the following wave, they were receiving the disability support pension. So we don't know at what point during that 12-month period they did make the transition.
But you don't know whether they previously.
Not in this analysis, although transitions off of the disability support pension aren't that common, but yes, it is a limitation. And given that we have 9 waves of data to this point in time, we could control for those conditions as well. Though having said that, with the analysis that we'll report subsequently, yes, I don't think that that's going to be a very large proportion of this population. No, we don't. That's a limitation with the HILDA data. We do. So we can pull out those other payment types, and we do that in some of the other analyses. Yep, and we can. So again, quick and dirty analysis just to see whether or not there is evidence in the HILDA data that we'd expect, given what we understand from the administrative data. And those figures are broadly consistent as well with the data. So 40% of respondents who transitioned to DSP reported prior diagnosis or treatment for a mental illness. So there's some evidence that increases our confidence that maybe the HILDA data might be a useful source, despite the fact that we're relying on self-report data on DSP to continue this investigation. And we've done a few other preliminary studies, but let's move on to this one now, because time is moving on. So what we're interested in here is the trajectories of mental health leading up to and post. So is it the case that there's a lot of variability? Does the episodic nature of mental illness undermine the utility, the appropriateness of the disability support pension for this population? Do they remain mentally ill over time? Does the receipt of DSP coincide with peak levels of morbidity? Those sorts of questions. So 15 waves of HILDA data. For this analysis, we're just focused on the continuous mental health scores. So the HILDA survey includes the SF36, which has the 5-item mental health index as one of the subscales. There's lots of work going on that demonstrates the validity of the MHI-5 as a marker of common mental disorders. It measures the symptoms of anxiety and depression. We've demonstrated that it's comparable in terms of its validity to the K10, that's the gold standard for use internationally, and superior to the GHQ that's used in a lot of British epidemiological research. to make it easier to understand, because the MHI5 Better Health has higher scores, we reversed scored that. So higher scores on these graphs represent worse mental health. And it's important to note we have similar patterns of results when we use a cut point on this scale, so estimating clinical diagnosis, or use a more robust measure that takes account of some of the binary disability measures that are included from wave 3 onwards. So here's a subsample of individuals over time, which really doesn't instill one with a lot of confidence, does it? But just to demonstrate that there is a fair degree of variability. But this is a very small subset of the larger population in Hilda. So the sort of modelling we use, I've described as a linear spline multi-level model, but some of the psychological literature talks about this as a multi-phase growth model. So we're using separate terms to model mental health leading to and subsequent to the transition to a disability support pension. The models look at both average effects and individual effects. So we're modelling both a random intercept and random slopes for these different terms. In building the model, we also looked at whether or not there's a need for a specific term that represents a non-linear contribution to mental health around that point of transition. So is there a marked increase beyond the trend that occurs immediately prior to or immediately post the movement onto the disability support pension? And we've looked at, in this analysis, a range of covariates that you'd expect: age, sex, education, partner status, other income support, and physical health, physical measures. So this analysis is limited to 11 waves prior to the disability support transition and 8 waves post the transition, so that we have at least 50 observations per cell. The biggest limitation is around missing data on the MHI5. So because the SF36 is included in the self-complete questionnaire with Hilda, there's a chunk of people each wave who don't return the self-complete questionnaire. So I think we lost around about 100 respondents because of missing data on the MHI5. We made it essential that we had measures of mental health at both the immediate pre and immediate post occasions, and so that's where we lost this data. So we can look at some sensitivity analysis and some imputation around this in subsequent analysis, just to see how robust it is to those missing cases. So all up, the analysis I'll report today involves just over 609 respondents with around 4,800 observations, with an average of 5 pre-DSP observations and about 4 post-DSP. The model, I felt the need to put a model up because I'm talking to economists, whereas I wouldn't normally. It sort of sits below the hood and I wouldn't report it. So we've centred time on the first wave when individuals reported receipt of DSP, and we're modelling the mental health of individual I at time t by the intercept at that particular time, both at the population. I'll get back to that. The sort of the change in mental health that's related to time getting closer to that DSP transition. So that term there. The change in mental health associated with time moving from the transition onto DSP, and then, as I mentioned before, a couple of terms that we tested as to whether or not there was a non-linear change in mental health immediately around that transition onto the DSP, and then the range of covariates. And so because we're modelling both average and individual intercepts and slopes, each of those terms comprises both the average level and then the individual level as well, and a complex covariance matrix that represents the interrelationship between all of those type varying termed random effects. So that's a couple of specific points that we're looking at the wave. So the transition occurs between wave T and T-1, and so this is a couple of specific terms that we test as to whether or not there's a nonlinear increase that's tied to the wave immediately before and or immediately post that transition to DSP. So is there something over and above the general trend that occurs over the longer term? We're right. Oh. I'll do this more often. Building the model using a log linear model fit statistic. So what we find is that a linear term representing the change in mental health as time approaches the DSP transition fits the data well with a minor addition. Similarly, we find that a linear term well describes, characterises the trend in mental health moving from the DSP transition with a minor addition. That minor addition being, as you alluded to, that there was a non-linear increase in mental health symptoms that occurred immediately prior to and immediately post the DSP transition. And there was no difference across these two occasions, and so we fit a single term representing the increase that occurs immediately prior to the transition onto DSP. So we have 3 time terms in this model. So here's that same subgroup of respondents where we've modelled, where we've applied the model to each individual's data, and here's the average effect as well. So as I was saying, there's a linear effect with mental health symptoms increasing with time approaching the DSP transition. There's a discontinuity, a jump that occurs immediately prior to the DSP transition. And then post-DSP, there's a linear trend of decreasing symptoms. So without the background noise, that's the model term with the increase leading up to the increase that's tied to the DSP transition, the arrow there representing the interval during which a person first receives disability support pension, and then the negative, the decline in symptoms post-DSP. And the model itself, so we have, with each year that an individual gets closer to their eventual transition onto a disability support pension, there's a 0.9, let's say a 1 point, because it's easier to say, increase in mental health symptoms. With the MHI-5, there's various points that are used to describe clinical significance. Often that's around 3 to 5 points. So over 3 years in the lead up to receiving a disability pension, there is what could be described as a clinically significant increase in symptoms. The decline in symptoms post-DSP is somewhat smaller, about half a symptom each year, and quite a large increase in symptoms that's specifically tied to that transition. Once we throw in those other covariates, it has very little effect on this model. And this model is robust to different modelling approaches, so using a fixed effects, ignoring the random intercepts or the random slopes, we get very similar coefficients. So to reiterate again, on average, mental health worsens the nearer a person gets to making the transition to DSP. The peak mental ill health occurs around about the time of transition, and there is evidence, at least at a population level, of subsequent improvement in mental health over time after the individual is on the DSP. But through this observation period, mental health never reaches the level that it was prior to that transition onto DSP. But it's important to recognise that this is the average. When we look at the variance of the slope, so if we just look at the post-DSP transition, it suggests that 95% of respondents show annual change in mental health that ranges between a 4-point improvement per year to a 2-point worsening per year. So we've got some indication as to what's happening at the average level, but there is a lot of heterogeneity within individuals over time as well. And so the key question, I think, at this point is who is it who's showing improvement, who shows the greatest decline? So more data and or analysis necessary at this point in time, and that sort of points to some of the potential benefits of linking HILDA with administrative data so we can look at the primary medical conditions as well. So, but to tease that out, let's have a look at another outcome measure and see whether or not the same pattern of results is consistent. I'm going to run out of time. So we looked at the role physical score, which is a focus on how physical health limits your ability to undertake activities of work or daily living. And what we see here is a different model that fits the data. Rather than a linear term or any additional terms around the transition, role physical is best explained by a model with both a linear and a quadratic effective time. And there is no significant change in role physical post the DSP transition. Some hint of a decline, but nothing that looks significant.
Just wanted to clarify how you're constructing the samples of the study. So I can see the first one where that sort of first transition into DSP.
Yep.
Sort of in the hazard of
Exactly. Yes.
DSP.
Yep.
You started out with the sample where none of them were receiving DSP at the start, so the sort of risk that you
Exactly. Yep.
And I'm presuming as soon as somebody makes a transition, you drop them from the sample. So
Yeah, we follow them for as long as we're observing them on DSP in this post-DSP transition. They're in there for as long as they're on DSP in that post-DSP transition phase.
Yeah, so I can see that in this study that you're keeping people in.
This is exactly the same sample. So this is just a different outcome. So rather than looking at mental health, we're looking at role physical. So this is suggesting a non-linear increase in the effect of physical health on activities of daily living, on work leading up to the transition to DSP, and then once they're on DSP, no hint of very little evidence for any change in role physical over time on DSP.
I was just wondering about the comparison group, so all the periods following the transition. So you haven't got people who are already on DSP, you just have from the start, so they never kind of sort of control group.
No.
Once somebody made the transition, they're then subsequently they're being compared to the new people who are sort of being added to the stock of DSP. As you can see, the sort of health is obviously deteriorating up to the period where you have a recipient. So
yep.
You expect that what
Yes, yes.
I'm just not sure about particularly the mental health, but who's been compared with who in that sort of post-transition?
Yes. So really what we're doing is we're just characterising the profile of mental health for that group over time. So both in the lead up to and then post that DSP transition. And I think the contrast here is whereas we see that decline over time in mental health or improvement over time in mental health, we don't see a corresponding improvement over time in role physical.
So the sample is of people from DSP or mental health. So these are just all DSP.
No, we don't know with the Hilda data what the rationale for what their primary medical condition is. We only know that they report receiving the disability support pension. Yep.
They're coming in just before they get on the bed.
Yep. Or it could be comorbidity, which is the next slide. So demonstrating a different profile. So we take this role physical measure and include that as a covariate in the previous model. So to what extent does the profile that we see with the pattern of mental health reflect physical functioning, physical health? And so what we see there is there's a little, but not a major effect on those trajectories pre and post. So we have an increase of 0.5 point in mental health symptoms. This is controlling for physical functioning limitations. So controlling for physical functioning limitations, we still have a 0.5 point increase in mental health. With each year, the individual gets closer to a disability pension receipt. We have a similar 0.5 point improvement in mental health post that DSP transition. But now we've accounted for the significance, if not all, of that specific increase that occurred around the transition to DSP, that non-linear jump that occurred. So it suggests that perhaps that change tied specifically to that disability transition may be a consequence of comorbid distress, mental illness tied to the physical complaints. I should move on just to finish the last slides. So 2 quick slides summing up. So the analysis of the Hilda survey data shows some consistency with what you'd expect based on the administrative data. We found that the transition to DSP does coincide with peak levels of psychiatric morbidity. And the question is, does this represent appropriate targeting? So is the disability pension going to those at a time who deserve it, who warrant it, and at a time that they need it? There's substantial worsening of mental health immediately prior to that transition. A hint that maybe some of this might be comorbid with physical impairment. It could be the stress of the application process. Some Norwegian analysis using a between-person analysis has come to that conclusion. They sort of described an increase in symptoms close to the time of transition and argue that might be the stressful application process. I'm not sure whether that's the case given the timing of the application process in Australia, but worthy of further investigation. The other possibility is that there's an incentive for individuals to present negatively, but would that be the case with HILDA data that's completely separate from the application process? Don't know. Maybe consistency. There's some evidence that mental health improves over time following receipt of DSP. So this gets back to some of those issues that the Productivity Commission was discussing in the report. Perhaps this differs for those with comorbid physical conditions, further investigation warranted. Limitations. Obviously, this is self-report data. There's more variability in DSP. I've sort of no longer considered people when they transitioned off of DSP in this analysis, but there was more transitions in DSP than what you'd expect from the administrative data. So people being presumably unsure about what payment they're receiving, reporting the wrong payment when they fill out their form. But the benefit is that these measures of health are independent of the assessment process. So some drawbacks compared to some of the other international literatures, but some benefits as well. So I think this makes a contribution to the current policy discussion around the episodic nature and the duration of mental disability and the disability support pension. I think, as I said, there's considerable variability amongst individuals. So it would be good as a next step to identify the different profiles, different groups. Who's showing the improvement, who's showing the stability over time. And I think one area where there may be an opportunity to do this is with talk around about HILDA survey data being linked to the administrative data. And so then we'd be in a position where we would be able to understand and know the primary medical condition at least, and then look at whether or not there are different profiles over time in the mental health of those who are receiving the pension because of a psychological mental health reason and those who are receiving it on the basis of other conditions. And that's it. Gosh, I thought that was going to be 45 minutes. Thank you. Mm-hmm. We're doing some work. We're trying to cross as many discipline boundaries as we possibly can. I think we're extending some of the work on fraud and stigma in a social psychology field. Maybe I should say behavioural economics and make it more attractive to policymakers. So looking at the characteristics that drive stigmatising attitudes in individuals using a personality type outcomes. So looking at vignettes and then asking people to rate the characters based on conscientiousness or agreeableness or other factors like that. So we have that work going on looking at perceptions, and then we're going to replicate with the HILDA data some of those self-report personality characteristics. So is there some consistency between perceptions and individual self-reports of these personality measures as well? So some work going on there. I think looking at between payment differences as well. Once we can characterise the stigma associated with different payment types, then to what extent does that lead to different hypotheses in terms of the relationship between mental health and different payment types, controlling for the range of other characteristics that we can observe.
Because in the first half of the talk, I wondered how people answer those questions and wondered whether or not what you were getting was a reflection of people's personality rather than a sensible assessment of the people who were on the scheme.
Yep.
Because they would probably have a sample size of 0 on which to actually base those assessments. And so what would be interesting to see whether or not the deterioration of people's attitude was part of the deterioration of people's respect for institutions generally, which is a very, very broad phenomenon comparing with a number of other indices.
Yep.
Which means that might be completely unrelated to the second half of the talk.
Yes, yes, potentially. I think I went for an eclectic mix of topics representing the broader involvement. The Qualtrics survey that we conducted does include a range of other measures that may be able to tease out a little bit of those broader issues, but not to any great extent. But I suppose the response is if we're concerned about community attitudes, then community attitudes exist regardless of knowledge or awareness. And the policy response to community attitudes isn't based on policy response to informed community attitudes. It may in fact be more driven by uninformed community attitudes. And exactly, yes. So this being a first step to try and describe what those community attitudes are through this survey work, which can be biased by the perception that individuals want to leave as well. Whereas I think the work that we're doing with the vignette experimental design is much less obvious because we're embedding the description of welfare receipt and the different payment types within a broader vignette. And so what we're picking up there are marked effects between the same character in the same circumstances receiving or not receiving unemployment benefits. So just throwing a simple line into a vignette is having a significant effect on the perceptions that individuals have of that character, but not in the same obvious way that you do when you're asking an explicit question about what's your attitude towards a particular category of individuals. So in that sense, I think that work is tapping into more implicit attitudes.
So in the data you also know whether people are working, right? So it's really interesting also to see, because everyone says, oh, we have to keep them attached to the labor market.
Yep.
If they go into the DSP and they continue to be attached to the labor market, maybe then the mental health.
Yes. Yes. Yep. I don't think, I can't recall the specific figures. I don't think there's a very strong relationship between DSP receipt and working, but there are some. So yes, certainly worth looking at.
Because they have to work, right? They are assessed because they have this job capacity assessment and they have a certain work capacity. And if they are, and I think a lot of them are assessed in the work capacity of at least 9 hours a week or something. And if they have that, then they also have to attend all these job search, job search and stuff like that.
I think one of the difficulties, particularly in the mental health domain, is that concern of individuals to test out their ability to work and the risk of losing pension in the longer term. So there's a reluctance amongst individuals to put themselves in the situation where they are testing themselves out and trying to see whether they can fit and contribute in the workforce because of their concerns about then not getting back onto the disability support pension if they do fail. So that's one of the focus of advocates within the area of mental health in particular, about making it easier for individuals to take that step, to test themselves out and to try working whilst not risking the security that the DSP offers them. Thank you.